Wes is the Member of Parliament for Ilford North. When we invited him to do this podcast, he was actually in the shadow Treasury team for the Labour Party. But as recently as I think it was Friday, Wes, you've got yourself a new job as Shadow Minister for Schools. So first of all, congratulations. And secondly, what does that role entail?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. No, I'm delighted. I mean, I've very much enjoyed being part of Annalisa Dodd's Shadow Treasury team for the last 6 months. And prior to that, as you know, I was on the Treasury Committee of the House of Commons for 5 years. So doing lots of work on economic policy. But as of last Friday, I was asked to become Shadow Minister for Schools. So but basically responsible for pretty much every aspect of policy affecting schools, you know, admissions, curriculum, attainment, examinations, and obviously there's a lot going on, particularly in COVID, but there's also a lot that's been going on for some time now in terms of educational disadvantage in our country. And as someone who grew up on free school meals, went to state school, you know, there's no doubt that the state education I received has changed my life and has helped me to go from being a kid on a council estate to a member of parliament. And you know, fundamentally, to be honest, before I became an MP, education and tackling educational inequality was where I spent my career working before I became an MP. So I must admit, when I first got the call saying we're thinking of moving you to schools, what do you think? I mean, it was a no-brainer for me because I'm, you know, my passion for education, but it was just tinged a bit with sadness because I've actually very much enjoyed working for Annalisa Dodds and Bridget Phillips in the Shadow Treasury team. But there'll be no doubt loads going on in the economy and plenty of ways that I can support from the back rather than the front.
And in the end, Wes, you have got a passion for education. It comes across in many of the things that you've written, and certainly the conversation we had a few months ago. It is something that, as I say, you're passionate about. What are the sort of things that you would hope to bring to the role? What are the sort of policy changes and ideas do you want to be presenting in the coming months and years?
So, I mean, as with most things at the moment, COVID dominates the conversation there. And as we saw with the GCSE and A-levels debacle, there are real challenges facing schools in terms of funding, in terms of keeping pupils and teachers safe, the extent to which it's causing disruption as teachers and pupils are taken out of school with positive tests or isolating because members of their households have had positive tests. So there are real challenges there that will kind of dominate a lot of my time, I think, in the coming weeks in particular. But beyond that, I mean, really what I want the next Labour government to do is to rewrite the story of educational disadvantage in our country. It is still the case that too many children arrive at school at the age of 5 already lagging behind their peers on literacy and numeracy if they're from poorer backgrounds. And in too many cases, that effectively caps their life chances and predetermines where they end up at that point. At GCSE, we've seen the attainment gap widening between those from the wealthiest backgrounds and those from the poorest backgrounds. And you know, so fundamentally, we're moving in the wrong direction. There are lots of things that hold children and young people back. And education isn't the only way in which we can try and create a more fair and just society where young people can grow up and be who they are and end up, you know, where they want to get to based on their talent rather than their background. But education is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet. And the last Labour government made huge strides in terms of tackling educational deprivation and disadvantage. We pumped huge resources into schools, which literally rebuilt schools, but also invested in high quality teaching, high quality school leadership. I mean, London, the city that I grew up in and represent, the contrast between the schools of Tower Hamlets when I was growing up there and where we got to by the end of that Labour government was a remarkable transformation. But I do feel like in England, we've been slipping backwards and we can't allow that to happen. And to be honest, during the pandemic, education has felt like an afterthought for the government. And I just think that's criminal, really, because loads of those young people sitting, particularly GCSEs and A-levels, you don't get a second chance to do that. And You know, of course, people can do things like resits, but fundamentally, you know, it really does hold you back if you're let down at that stage. So I want to make sure that this academic year, we don't fail young people in the same way. But as I say, beyond COVID, I think we've got to make sure that education is a #1 priority for the Labour Party, because as Keir Starmer said in his recent speech to our virtual conference, he wants Britain to be the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. And education is absolutely central to that vision.
And Wes, I'll move on to the economy and where we are in terms of the COVID-19 situation in a moment. But one final point on education. I'm sure you'll be aware, because you speak to businesses every day of the week, that frustration that many of us have in the world of commerce, that we can't get the people that we need in terms of the skill sets required. And part of that has to be a failure of not just schools, but the wider education, training, skills, facilities, products that are available out there. And if I had one criticism of the last Labour government around the education piece, it was this drive to get everybody into university. I think we're starting to accept evidence around the fact that sometimes vocational training, as long as it's of the necessary quality, can actually be as valuable as getting a traditional degree, if I can put it that way. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I strongly supported the 50% target under the last Labour government, because I think it helped to transform a mindset that enabled more young people to go to university, more mature students to go to university, but also more working class kids to go to university. And that was really important in terms of raising aspirations, raising attainment, and sort of getting working class students into our universities. I think the big weakness, though, was that there wasn't as strong a vision and an argument and clear pathways for what's been described as the other 50%. University isn't going to be the right path for everyone. And I think that's partly about making sure that we've got, as you say, high quality routes available, making sure that those routes are held in high esteem by employers and by students and their families. I mean, I've always joked that, you know, we had a widening participation to get more working class kids to university. We probably need a widening participation agenda to get more old Etonians to go and do an apprenticeship. But it is a cultural problem in this country. If you look at countries like Germany, which is often held up as the example, you know, vocational education is not seen as some sort of second order achievement or second tier. It is highly valuable. So, you know, and the other point I'd make is, and I think we'll see this writ large during this recession that we're about to live through, is lifelong learning is also really important. It's important for people who've just lost their jobs and might need to reskill and retrain. But also, if you think about the longer term future and the fact we're going to be living longer, probably working longer, we've got technology changing the world of work in really significant ways and ways that are presently unimaginable. We are all going to need to keep our skills up to date, and that's where lifelong learning, I think, really comes into its own. And of course, you know, there is a fundamental value in education in and of itself, and education for its own sake, and passing the collective body of human knowledge.
There are going to be many people who are displaced from employment, many people who perhaps find fewer and fewer opportunities in industries employed them for the last decade.
On lifelong learning as well. And the Chancellor needs to act on that very quickly. I mean, that's why we called for £3 billion of spending that he'd committed through the National Skills Strategy to be brought forward, because he needs to get that money out the door pretty quickly to make sure that opportunities are there, so that, you know, because I can tell you there is nothing worse than finding yourself unemployed, maybe running a small business and you've been excluded from any of the government support schemes so far as well, and then seeing the Chancellor pop up on the telly talking about reskilling and retraining, and you're pulling your hair out saying, well, reskill where? Retrain to do what? Help, you know, I need to get back to work. Where are the pathways? And I think we've got really big gaps there, and they need to be filled very quickly, because there are going to be a lot of people out there experiencing already real hardship. and misery. And there are only going to be more of those people, I fear, in the coming months because of the way in which this pandemic is shaping out.
The disappointing thing for me was about the Kickstart program for young people that was announced by the government was, again, this lack of recognition of how important the SME community is to the business ecosystem. And so for a business like mine, for example, you know, I'm desperately wanting to give something back. And we are in a fortunate position that the company, despite the challenges we face, is growing. But you've got to take on at least 30 people to get involved in that Kickstart program. Now, we formed consortia with the City of Liverpool College in Liverpool, but that doesn't help us in Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, other places that we're based. And again, you've got to go then through bureaucracy, red tape. Any chance that the opposition could put a bit of pressure on the Chancellor? I think sometimes unintended consequences emerge from these policies. Because as I say, there's lots of small businesses, Wes, who would not only be grateful of the opportunity to take on young person and train them, but there would be a job at the end of it. And again, as I say, that's training with a purpose. And I think we've cut out a whole group of companies who would have been able to assist in that regard.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, in a lot of SMEs, they'll be getting the sort of hands-on experience and the ability to do a range of things and develop a range of skills that will serve them really well in terms of their longer term careers as well. Because, you know, anyone who's worked in small business will tell you, you know, you don't have, you know, the HR department over here and the finance department over here and the sales team over, you know, everyone has to do a bit of everything because, you know, you don't have like that large or, you know, resource base. So you've got a real opportunity there to kind of try your hand at a number of things and to learn a number of different things. So, I mean, that would be part of the value of the Kickstarter scheme, but I agree with you. The bureaucracy is in the way of a consortium with the college in Liverpool. But there might be a lot of business owners who are logging on thinking, great, I'll have one of these Kickstart, young people. And then thinking, actually, the bureaucracy of this is too much time, it's too much hassle, I haven't got the time. Because that's the other thing as well, you know, people are really busy running their businesses. Their businesses are probably already struggling enough throughout all of this. So the idea you have to jump through loads of hoops and start, you know, casting the net, looking for partners, it's added bureaucracy. And you know, and I can understand why, from a government perspective, they want fewer agencies and organisations to deal with. But, you know, what's convenient for the government, you know, I think there's a real question to be asked about that as to whether or not the scheme will deliver the sorts of outcomes that the government really needs it to. And they may end up finding themselves, they're sort of, you know, the old penny wise, pound foolish kind of notion, you know, they're sort of cutting corners in some respects to try and cut down their bureaucracy, but they may find the costs of doing so are much bigger because there are more young people completely out of work, and there are small businesses that could benefit from this scheme in a really meaningful way who won't participate.
Absolutely. Wes, moving on to where we are at the moment with the coronavirus challenge, and it's a movable feast. I'm reading this morning that, you know, Andy Burnham has been in overnight, I was going to say negotiations, not really. He's had a letter from the government basically saying sign up or we're going to impose those tier 3 restrictions on Greater Manchester. I know London is moved into tier 2 now, I think I'm right in saying. Yeah. And Liverpool have been in tier 3 along with Lancashire since last week. I'm sure you're sensing from the north of England an awful lot of frustration, if not anger, at the way in which these restrictions are happening. It's not as if we are less bothered about saving lives in this part of the world, but we don't seem to be getting any evidence, Wes, that local lockdowns work. Indeed, I think Labour produced a document to suggest that in 19 of the 20 places where local lockdowns had taken place, it hadn't had a fundamental impact on the COVID infection rates. And so I think, you know, Andy Burnham, Sir Graham Brady, let's not make this a party political thing in Greater Manchester. The political leaders there have been absolutely right in saying to the government, well, if you're going to lock us down under what are fairly draconian measures, I have to say, demonstrate to us the evidence that that lockdown is going to have a genuine effect.
Yeah, I think there are two problems here. Everyone is willing to do the right thing to help beat coronavirus, but people want to know two things. One, is it going to work? And is the pain worth the hassle? And secondly, if we're going to do the right thing, are we going to receive the support we need from government to do it? And I think that's where Andy Burnham, and as you say, it's not just Andy, it's political leaders across Greater Manchester, Labour and Conservative MPs, and local councillors, all on the same page of asking government those two central questions. And to be honest, I can't believe we're in this position where there just isn't a default support package in place, so that, you know, just as you've got, you know, if you're in tier 2, these are the restrictions, and there should also be, and here's the government support that you can access. And that should be consistent, it should be standard, it shouldn't be down to Andy sort of basically holding government's feet to the fire and saying, I need this support for Greater Manchester and I'm not going to say anything less. You know, there should be consistent support in place so that we need this kind of wrangling. And again, I just think the government is very short-sighted about this. I mean, in tier 3, there are lots of businesses that have just been closed through no fault of their own. They are closed, not running, and support available to doesn't even scratch the surface in terms of, you know, people's wages, their overheads. And so let's not forget the cost of reopening. I mean, everyone talks about hospitality, obviously, for example. If you're a restaurant that's been made to close, when you're reopening again, it's just a case of opening your doors and switching the lights on. You have to order a whole new load of stock. You've got loads of perishable goods that you wouldn't have sold, so you've just completely written off that cost. And you know, I just sometimes think that policymakers aren't putting themselves in the shoes of people who actually run businesses, and about the sort of the practical things that they're going to be worried about, and of course people who are now off work and absolutely terrified about how they're going to pay their bills. So the government's got to fix that. In tier 2, you know, as you'll know, having been through it, and huge parts of the country have now been through tier 2. A lot of businesses are open in name only, so they're still allowed to trade. They've got all the costs involved of coming in, switching the lights on, putting people to work, but they haven't got the customers coming through the door. Because funnily enough, you know, a lot of people, whether it's going shopping or, you know, going out for a meal or going out for drinks, often it's a social activity and you do it with people outside your own household. And particularly the other thing is about consumer confidence is, as people are seeing all these new measures kicking in, it is denting their own confidence to go out and spend money. So even where people are able to go out and spend money and might want to go out and spend money, they're thinking, oh, actually, if I lose my job, better put some money away in the savings. You know, do we really need it? Do we really want it? Do we, you know, let's save for a rainy day because we don't know what's going to happen. So I think there are real issues there around consumer confidence as well. So all in all, this isn't working. I mean, you might have seen Labour's called for a national circuit breaker lockdown. That's what the Independent SAGE Government Advisory Committee has called for. And although, you know, I understand why people might kind of go, or national lockdown, is that really necessary? How much will that cost? I think we've all got to bear in mind the cost of inaction and proceeding with a failed strategy. And if we lock down the way we did before, national lockdown, economic support to go with it, and then came back, I think it would not only set back the spread of the virus, it would buy us some extra time that we need, and would also potentially save us a hell of a lot of pain in the long run, both in terms of loss of life and people's livelihood. So I think the Chancellor needs to ask himself some pretty hard questions about how much the cost of failure is going to cost him and the Treasury.
I'm back on. Sorry about that. Just bear with me a second. Dear me, the joys of modern technology.
I know Zoom's not all it's cracked up to be, is it? I was just saying to Heather, I was like staring at the screen blankly thinking, have I frozen? Is he frozen?
Yeah, I think I'm having problems this morning. It's what happens when you go into tier 3, Wes. You've got all this to look forward to. Listen, just you've talked there about, you know, a circuit break and a national lockdown. I can see some advantages to that. First and foremost, and this shouldn't be underestimated, in a United Kingdom, I don't think, at least people will think there was some consistency and fairness. And I do think places like Greater Manchester, Liverpool, Lancashire, feeling somewhat discriminated at the moment because,
Yeah.
as I say, the evidence doesn't seem to stack up. But I am concerned, increasingly concerned, Wes, about the damage this is doing to the economy. And you can't put hospitality in a box. I think that's the other mistake the government are making. They're saying, okay, if we close you, there's some help available. We can argue whether the help's enough or not, but there's some help available. But as you've rightly pointed out there, consumer confidence now is through the floor. So if you're a retail outfit, you've not been ordered to close by the government. You stay open. If you do close, there's no help available for you. And then I could go on right through the ecosystem of business. We've got to have, if we do lock down, an infrastructure and a support mechanism that matches what was in place back in March, April time.
Yeah, and I think you're right about unintended consequences. I heard a radio report just the other week about turkey sales and farmers being really worried about the number of orders they've had on turkeys from some of the big retailers and butchers, because they're planning for a drop in Christmas orders because people aren't sure whether they're going to be able to get together for the big family dinner in the way they normally would. I think it's a question all families are currently sort of asking themselves at the moment, you know, what we're going to be doing over the Christmas period. You know, and so there are going to be all of these unintended consequences. And of course, you know, it all works as an ecosystem. One of the reasons why central London has really struggled in terms of its economy is because Theatreland is closed. And there are loads of people who, when they go to theatre, will pop, you know, go for a meal, go for some drinks, might even pop into the shops and make a sort of an afternoon or, you know, a day out of it. So, you know, let's not pretend that parts of the economy are working in silos and that they're not interconnected, because, you know, whether it's, you know, the sort of the retail and hospitality, entertainment ecosystem, the wider supply chain issues, there are really serious challenges here. And like you, I am really worried about sort of the economic impact of this, because this also has a direct impact on our public health, on mental health, people's well-being. I'm very, very worried about sort of where we're getting to on all of this. And of course, this is the balancing act that government has to wrestle with, and we're wrestling with as well, because when Keir announced the circuit breaker call, he didn't do that lightly. I mean, as people have noticed, and we've even been criticised for it at points, we have tried really hard to work constructively with the government, to not deviate from the government, especially when they're following the scientific evidence, because we've never thought throughout this pandemic it's helpful to have political leaders on different pages and saying different things, because it confuses the message, it potentially reduces compliance with important measures. But we felt the government had diverged from the scientific evidence. We felt that both the consequences for public health and the economic pain would be greater as a result. But we'll have to see if we can persuade the government to sort of do otherwise. Because the other thing we've got hanging around in the background is, as we get further into winter, you know, the NHS always has challenges with winter pressures. We always have an NHS winter crisis. If you layer on top of that a COVID pandemic where there are more hospitalizations, that's potentially very worrying territory. And let's not forget, in all of this, the reason why we did the lockdown initially, it wasn't just about saving lives, it was about protecting the NHS, and it was about saying, look, you know, we will treat you, but the NHS can't cope if we're overwhelmed. And I don't think we should lose sight of that dimension in all of this either.
It baffles me as well, Wes, and I don't want to come across as just, you know, government bashing here, because as you've recognised, this is a unique set of circumstances. No political leader, no prime minister would want to be having to cope with this sort of crisis, and it's been difficult and challenging, and we recognise that. But you say there we did the initial lockdown to protect the NHS, and we're being told now, likewise, our intensive care beds, for example, are being filled, and we've got. I'm looking at the investment that was made in that 6 months, and I'm looking at, for example, Eat Out to Help Out, and I'm wondering why that money wasn't used to improve infrastructure in our hospitals, employ more nursing staff, employ more care workers. It seems to me that this isn't a strategy that we've got in place. This is finger in the wind stuff. And that's what's frustrating me. And listen, people are aware of my politics, and I'll happily say that I'll support the Labour Party by and large, but I'm critical when I think I need to be critical. I was certainly critical of the last Labour Party leader. But I don't know what the end game here is, Wes. So if we get through this winter crisis and we reopen, let's say February, let's take as long as that, but then we have another spike. Do we just continually have these lockdowns? It's not sustainable, in my opinion.
I think a lot of us have been feeling miserable. I mean, it's interesting when the tier 2 restrictions kicked in where I live. I wasn't quite ready for the psychological impact of that, in terms of, the things that I had to cancel, the friends I was going to go and see, the family that I was going to go and see. And it just psychologically, it just feels like you've just been set back and we're moving in the wrong direction. You start to think, well, how long is it now until we're in tier 3? And of course, I didn't say that too loudly on the media last week, because frankly, when London went into lockdown, most of the country was saying, welcome to our world. Now you can have a piece of our action. We all bloody hate you. So I have to kind of always keep that in mind as a sort of a London. I always say, it depends on who I'm talking to. Technically, I'm a Greater London MP, but when I talk to people around the rest of the country, I tend to emphasise the fact that Ilford is technically in Essex. So try and clear that London, because everyone hates it. But more seriously, I think people do want to see that there is a strategy. They want to know where we're going. They know it's not going to be perfect, and they know that ultimately we need a vaccine, but people just want a bit of clarity about the direction and where we're heading. And that's really what's missing at the moment, and why I think the circuit breaker for us wasn't just about setting back the virus, also about saying, let's reset the strategy. Let's provide some clarity of leadership. Let's get the test, track and isolate system working, because that is a fundamental problem. And just going back to what you were saying about Eat Out to Help Out, I think Rishi Sunak was given a lot of plaudits at the very beginning of this crisis because of the scale of the response, which matched the scale of the challenge. So we had the furlough scheme, self-employment income support scheme. And not only did we welcome those things, we actively encouraged the government to do those things. And the government sat down with trade unions, business leaders. It was a very collaborative approach. And he was lauded for it, and he deserved the credit. But a number of interventions he's announced since feel very gimmicky. So, I thought the job retention bonus was a good example, where HMRC had said, we're not convinced this is going to have the desired effect of actually bringing more workers back from furlough than otherwise would have been laid off. They described it as a dead weight cost, but he went ahead with it. And there are other examples of sort of government waste and things that they're spending money on, where you think, is that really the greatest priority? In Parliament this week, we're having another argument about whether or not we should feed hungry children during the school holidays. And Marcus Rashford has had to kind of get back into his campaigning gear again, because he's seen this problem coming, we've seen this problem coming, and the government is refusing to budge. And you think, well, how much did the government spend subsidising people who are well off enough to go out for a meal during the summer for Eat Out to Help Out, but we're not going to feed children who are literally at risk of going hungry during the school holidays? It's a question of priorities. And we will continue to challenge the government on that. And I think Rishi Sunak has got to go back to the sort of collaborative, evidence-led approach that he seemed to have at the beginning of this crisis, and not go for the gimmicks, because that's where I think we get wasted resources, and it is breeding resentment. I've been spending time talking to people in my own constituency and across the country who haven't received a penny of government support at all since April, the excluded. And they are absolutely, it's not just that they're angry, they are really frightened about how they're going to manage. And so when you kind of see government ads saying, eat out to help out, they're kind of saying, well, how am I going to afford to eat in? And when you see the government saying what a great job they're doing, or you know, they're spending billions here, and HMRC saying, well, that's a waste of money, they're thinking, well, we could have some of that. £6 billion would have made a real difference to us. So, you know, that we're going to be holding the government to account on that as well, and challenging them on value for money and where they're spending their money.
Now, Wes, we were going to keep you for a little longer this morning, but this internet connection today, for some reason, is very unstable, and I don't want to keep getting kicked out of this and frustrating you. And I know you've got lots of things to be getting on with. So if anybody has got a question, put it in the chat room for Wes, and we'll put it to him quickly. But final point from me, and it's a more general point, really. Back in December, Conservative government won a massive majority of 80, and you know, I think, not to put it too cruelly, Labour Party looked dead and buried. A week's a long time in politics. Certainly 9 months is. There's been a total transformation of the opposition. I think Keir Starmer is demonstrating a more pragmatic approach to politics that is winning him many plaudits, and rightly so. But from your part of the world, I'm sure you're sensing that perhaps one or two people are having buyer's remorse in those red wall seats. Nevertheless, there's still an awful long way to go. We're 4 years from the next general election. A big uphill battle for Labour to get back into government. What are the sort of strategic steps, Wes, that you think Labour has to take between now and then to continue this trajectory that you've enjoyed in recent months?
It got a bit messy there on the connection.
Still with us?
I've got most of the question. Well, first and foremost, it does help having a leader who looks like and sounds like a credible prime minister. And I think that's reflected in Keir's approval ratings with the public. I think they look at Keir Starmer, they see a serious person who's done a serious job outside politics as Director of Public Prosecutions, is deeply principled, will put the national interest first, and is signalling a new leadership, not just for the Labour Party, but potentially a new leadership for the country if we're given that chance after the next election. I think you're right about voters who are looking in on the Conservative Party, many of whom voted Conservative for the first time and are thinking, well, you know, we know exactly why we voted Conservative, but, you know, we are also seeing the worst of the Conservative Party at the moment. But that doesn't mean for a moment that we're complacent and think that we will just win power because the Conservatives are crap. We've got to actively earn back people's trust. And the truth is that Keir's ratings are fantastic. The party's ratings are still nowhere where they need to be. So we've got a mountain to climb. We've started climbing that mountain, but we know we've got to earn back trust on the economy, on being trusted with our national security and defence. And, you know, as I always say, people often know Labour's heart's in the right place. They want to know our head is in the right place too. So as long as we keep on speaking to the real issues that people care about, as long as we've got practical answers that people can believe in, there is every chance, even with the mountain we've got to climb, that we can win the next general election. As I always say, Labour's got to climb Mount Everest to win the next election. The good news is we know that climbing Everest can be done because it's been done before. So we know it can be done, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of hard work, zero complacency on our part, and we've got to speak to and for every section of every community in every part of the country to win.
Okay. I'm just going to take this one question from an old friend of yours and mine, Jim Hancock. He's asking what Labour will do about private schools. So an easy one to end with, Wes.
Yes. So, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, I'm more interested in the education of the 93% and the 7%. 93% of children in this country don't attend private schools. They go to state-funded schools. And fundamentally, my focus is about them and how we get the very best education for them. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that private education, you know, works against equal opportunity in this country. And when you look at things like university admissions or the dominance of the professions by people from private schools, that is a real challenge. But I don't think the Labour Party will change that picture if we're just obsessing and talking about and debating 7% of schools that work outside the mainstream system. We've got to be focused on the 93%. And ultimately, you know, I want to get to a position where parents, you know, many of whom, by the way, when they send their kids to private schools, make quite a lot of financial sacrifices to do so. I want to get to a point where particularly those parents think, well, don't need to send my kids to private school because the state school up the road is fantastic. And I want my kids to have a comprehensive education alongside children from a wide range of backgrounds. So that will be my focus, the 93%, and, you know, the 7% can take care of themselves, I'm sure.
Wes, I'm awfully sorry for the poor connection this morning, but it's
right.
It's not diminished what's been a really interesting and detailed contribution from yourself as well, in terms of, you know, education, skills training, but also more importantly, the crisis that we face. We do have a live event with you in London penciled in, so I'm keeping everything crossed that can go ahead. I think it's November we've got that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Whenever it happens, we'll be looking forward to it. And I did tell Annalisa Dodds that I was doing this event with you this morning as well. So I'll certainly feed back some of the issues you've raised, Frank, which, you know, won't come as a surprise to her. But I think it's always good just to keep on reminding ourselves and reinforcing the kind of the key issues that people are talking about across the country, because, you know, fundamentally it's our job to make sure that those issues are amplified and resolved here. So thanks very much for your time, and to people who've joined us, and people who are listening, you know, do feel free to contact me and keep in touch.
Wes, great to see you as always.
Thanks, Frank. Take care. Have a nice day, everyone.
In the new job. Cheers, mate. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.